Sage, who am I?
On social media, they portrayed themselves as parents in mourning, a couple who had just lost the 7-month-old girl they loved so much. But authorities in Chapin, South Carolina say there is much more to this story and more than what was posted on social media. Both parents are now behind bars, charged with their infant's murder. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. It is not easy to tell stories like this one, where the victim is so young and so vulnerable. And then you add in what authorities are now saying in South Carolina, that this young victim died at the hands of her parents. Here's a picture of that young girl. Her name was Sage Nix. You can see she was just a young, beautiful little girl, her entire life ahead of her. She was just 7 months old. Authorities in Richland County, South Carolina say on December 18th, 2024, emergency crews arrived at a home in this rural area of the town of Chapin to a baby who was unresponsive. First responders say they found parents performing CPR on the little girl. They rushed her to the hospital, but that is where she passed away. It's important to note that authorities say from the very beginning they found the death of Sage to be suspicious and they launched an investigation. Then on February 14th, Valentine's Day, Sage's parents, Kyla and Caleb Nix, were arrested and charged with homicide by child abuse. The facts of this story are shocking to say the least. They're incredibly sad, and what we found to be as shocking, frankly more shocking, is as this investigation was going on, which authorities say they found this death to be suspicious from the very beginning, the parents were posting on social media as if they had lost a daughter to a freak accident. This is the mom's Facebook page. Again, her name is Kyla, and you can see in the 3 weeks after Sage died, she posted a link to a meal train for people to donate money for the couple to eat. She writes that she and her husband are, quote, broken, and say that they're in need. And, quote, food is good for the soul and belly. Please help us and pray over the meals y'all are providing. At last check, $365 were donated to this couple. And in the weeks that followed their young girl's death, Kyla posted tributes to Sage, like this video of her and her father Caleb, who's also accused in her murder.
Sage, who am I? Who am I?
Who this? Sage. Hey.
Sage. Sage. Peanut.
And with that video, Kyla writes that dada was Sage's favorite word. Now, even though on social media this couple truly made it seem like they were the perfect, loving family, look at this picture with the words unconditional love and harmony printed on it. Authorities say Sage's death was considered suspicious from the start. The county coroner said in a news conference that not only was Sage's cause of death blunt force trauma, but it was intentional. That is according to the local newspaper, The State. The coroner also said it took several weeks to make an arrest because of the amount of time it took to look through records, including records from pediatrician visits and trips to the emergency room. Now, even though the coroner mentioned that in a news conference, at the time of this recording, it is unclear what those records actually showed investigators. In that news conference, the Richland County coroner wouldn't say exactly what was in those details. She kept it tight-lipped. Here's part of what she did say to local news station WACH-TV.
There were some things that looked suspicious to us and some things that we were able to question both of the parents about. But again, we don't want to do anything that would jeopardize the justice that would happen for this baby.
Joining us now to talk a little bit more about this investigation and how we got to this point is Dr. Michelle Dupree, who is a former medical examiner as well as a former police officer and has worked in South Carolina. Thank you, doctor, for taking the time to be with us. I know this is not an easy story to talk about. The coroner in the county determined that blunt force trauma was the cause of death for this little girl. Take us inside the investigation and as a medical examiner, you're doing an autopsy, how you get to that determination.
Well, there's a lot of steps. One thing that we always like to do in child death investigations is we want to visit the scene of where this happened. We want to take a look at everything, the total surroundings, not just one thing. We want to look at, where the child is, what happened. We also, oftentimes we ask someone to recreate what happened. In this case, it sounds like it was relatively obvious from the beginning that this may not have been accidental. And so that always puts us on guard. And, children and babies shouldn't just die. And so we have to do a thorough investigation, which includes the autopsy, but it also includes things like toxicology, and also looking at past history. Has this child had a lot of medical issues in the past? And if so, what are they? Is there some reason that, that this may have been an accidental death? And that's one of the things that we really want to try and determine, was this accidental or non-accidental? And that's so very important, and oftentimes hard to tell. But head injuries are often the most common cause of deaths in children this age.
Yeah, because the coroner was very clear in saying that not only was blunt force trauma to the head the cause of death, but this was an intentional act. During an examination as a medical examiner, what little details can you see to determine that this was intentional as opposed to a fall? I mean, obviously there was an investigation by law enforcement that also contributed to this finding, but as far as the examination, what can you learn there?
And that's always a very good question. And so, when we fall, we typically injure things that are normal injuries. We injure our bony prominences, our elbows, our knees, our nose. When we have injuries in places that are not like that, then it's suspicious. And again, one thing we really have to consider is this is a 7-month-old baby. What can that baby actually do? They're not walking, so they can't actually walk over and, do something. So what is the ability of a child that age? And if that doesn't match up with the story that we're hearing, then it's obviously very suspicious. We look at actually the injury itself. When a child is hit with an object, or when anyone is hit with an object, it creates a depressed fracture. When we fall and we hit our head, it isn't depressed. It's more like just an eggshell fracture or something of that nature. But if it's depressed, then we know that an object struck that person.
And I know you're a former police officer as well, and law enforcement said in the announcement that these parents were going to be charged that they found the death of this little girl to be suspicious from the very beginning. When someone is responding to an emergency like this, what are some of the telltale signs that this may not have been an accident?
Well, one of the things obviously is we want to separate the parents so that they can't compare their stories. We want to interview them separately. We want to find out if they change their story in that length of time. Is anything else in the house suspicious? How are they reacting? And people do react differently to grief, but then there are also some telltale signs that this may be, not really what is expected. And so we want to take a look at that.
And I know you talked about toxicology tests and results, and that was part of what the coroner had talked about. But when you're talking about a blunt force trauma, when you think of like an overdose, I mean, you would think that toxicology tests will play a critical role in that type of case. But this is a blunt force trauma case. What can a toxicology report tell you in something like this?
Well, we want to be thorough. And we have a saying in the forensic pathology profession that an incomplete autopsy will give incomplete results. If that child was on drugs or had some kind of drugs that they shouldn't have in their system, we want to make sure that there is nothing else that could contribute to the death.
We don't know what the history, at least publicly, that this child had gone through, if there were previous cases of abuse. The coroner did mention that they looked at emergency room visits in the past, speaking kind of broadly about it, that in these investigations, that's what you do, and also talking about pediatrician visits. During an exam, even though the cause of death may have been to the head, is the autopsy something where you're looking for other signs of abuse that may have happened during that exam? Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, we do a complete autopsy. We do an external examination, first of all, which we record every, bruise and scratch or scrape. Some of them are normal, some are accidental. But we also try to look at any aging. We x-ray the complete body to see if there is any signs of previously broken bones or current fractures. Then we also, of course, we examine the body internally to look for any signs of trauma, not just to the head, but any place else on the body. And then, of course, lastly is the toxicology. So it's a three-part process.
And you know this area of the country really well. You worked in the Columbia, South Carolina area as a medical examiner. You know this office that determined that this was a murder investigation and not just an accident. What do you make of how the coroner and law enforcement approached this investigation?
I think it was excellent. From the very start, the county sheriff became suspicious and called in the appropriate forces to help them. And that's really the team approach. Oftentimes in child abuse investigation cases, we have something called a multidisciplinary team. And it's experts from various fields, social services, law enforcement, medical, governor's office, and others that are going to look at things from a different perspective and then put it all together. And this was done from the very beginning. So kudos to the whole team. They did a great job.
And what do you make of the timeline? Because in December is when this death happens, the arrests and arraignment not until Valentine's Day. Why did it take so long?
Well, part of that reason is because of the investigation. Again, we want to be very thorough. Toxicology is often backed up in the lab, but we don't want to accuse anybody or make any mistakes. So we want to cover all the bases, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and sometimes it just takes that long to do a thorough investigation.
Yeah, and I know you've also written a book on the issue of child abuse, and it's hard to kind of wrap your head around these kind of cases for people who haven't investigated them. And just like us in the media, we cover the stories and then people are watching who read it. But what stood out to me as I was doing my research was just the public Facebook pages of these parents, where after the child's death, you would never have guessed that they would ever be accused of this girl's murder. And you would never guess that it was anything more than a loving household. How common is it to see that type of social media activity, even as police said that this was a suspicious death from the beginning?
Actually, it's very common. We call this a forensic countermeasure, and people committing any kind of crime often will try to hide it or misdirect the police or the investigation. And so this is not really uncommon. They're going to act like grieving parents, but generally you can see through that this is an act and it isn't genuine.
And we'll see what more information comes out. And I just have to ask, I mean, for you as a medical examiner, and I'm sure you get questions like this all the time when people find out your background and the work you do. I mean, emotionally, how do you approach an autopsy, especially when we're talking about a 7-month-old child?
It's very difficult. Nothing really prepares you for this. And the worst cases are child abuse and the elderly, because we're here to protect them. And they weren't protected. And often, unfortunately, especially with child abuse, it is someone in the family. It is someone that child loves. If they're old enough to talk and walk, oftentimes they won't even tell anyone that they're being abused. And they won't do that because they still love that person. And when we do get a fatality, it's very hard. It's hard to separate the emotion, but it's something that we have to do. And we learn to do that. We know that we're doing it to help the child. We're doing it to help law enforcement, to help the court, and to bring justice for that child that didn't deserve this.
And in the coroner also, a soundbite that stood out to me in her news conference was saying that she is something along the lines of saying, like, she's going to be darn sure if she's going to put murder on a death certificate, that's in fact what it's going to be. For you, what is that moment like as a medical examiner when you do an autopsy and it may not have been a clear murder, but it's something you realize that foul play was actually responsible?
It's heart-wrenching. It really is. There's no real words to describe it. Most of the time, fortunately, you don't know that person or that child that is on your autopsy table, but nonetheless, you have a connection with them, and you realize that it is your job to tell their story because they cannot tell it any longer. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's really true. We are there to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, and to help get justice for whatever happened to that person. And so in the end, it's very rewarding, but initially it's shocking, it's heart-wrenching, and it's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's such difficult work that medical examiners do, but as we're seeing in a case like this one, it's incredibly important work. Dr. Michelle Dupree, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Joining us now is former prosecutor with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office and practice professor of law at Temple University, Marian Bracha. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know that you've worked a lot of child abuse cases in your career. I just want to start with the Facebook pages of the parents, because to see what they are now accused of, but then you go back in time and you see them posting a link for donations and the funeral for their daughter and talking about how much how much they loved their daughter. How common is it to see that in these kinds of cases?
Well, ordinarily not common. We don't typically see too much commentary from an accused defendant, someone who's facing charges. Ordinarily, once they have counsel attached, they're advised to exercise their Fifth Amendment rights and remain silent. Now, of course, before the charges attached and before they were considered suspects, they wouldn't have had that constitutional concern. So there is nothing really precluding the prosecutors from using the Facebook posts so long as they can be authenticated, so long as they can be attributed back to either one of the defendants. They can certainly use the words of the defendants themselves against them in court, barring some kind of pretrial motion that would preclude mention of them. At the same time, there might be a defense theory that's actually helpful to the defendants, that for all of the time immediately after the child's death, these two people were posting professions of their love for her and how much they missed her. And why would someone with a guilty mind be asking for support while they grieve, be asking for support for funeral expenses and for daily life activities, things like that. So it is a storyline that I think with this litigation could go either way.
You have worked a lot of child abuse cases in your career. Typically, how do these investigations work, where you have this emergency that authorities are called to at a home, and then eventually get to a point months later where the parents are charged with murder?
Unfortunately, that is oftentimes how the investigations unfurl. And I have all the respect in the world for the coroner, who released a statement saying that we took our time with this investigation, that we really wanted to look into the records, look into any past hospital visits, look into pediatric records, to really ascertain what the cause and manner of death was in this child's case. And so with the time to do a full and comprehensive investigation, to look into the dynamics of this family, to look into the specific cause of the injury that led to the death in this case, I think it makes sense that there was a delay between the death and the charging, and it allowed for the authorities to do what they really needed to do to make sure that they had all of the evidence in place to make the right call in terms of charging these people and proceeding to prosecution against anyone.
Yeah, because I did find it, just going back to the Facebook page, where it just seems like this family, I mean, within days they're posting about this loss that they had. And as you pass by the page and you didn't know that they were charged with the girl's murder, and again, all, innocent until proven guilty, you would never suspect that this was a family where this type of case would happen. And yet police say they were suspicious from the very beginning, that they launched an investigation from the beginning. How likely is it that the parents knew that they were being investigated for murder over the last several weeks leading up to their arrest?
So I think it's likely possible. I think it's possible that they knew that they were under investigation. Remember that a lot of times these investigations will center around interviewing people that are close to the family, interviewing other child care providers, interviewing other service providers that may have been involved with the family. I don't see any indication that there was prior child and youth services involvement, but there would be interviews conducted of social workers, of prior caregivers, care providers, medical care providers. I mean, things like pediatricians and nurses. If this child had been in daycare or in school, they would have been talking to a school nurse or to teachers or to guidance counselors about how this child presented. So in that case, because the circle that is close to these parents would have been involved ostensibly, they would have been at least contacted by the authorities doing the investigations, it probably would have gotten back to the defendants that they were being investigated. I don't think it would have come as a total shock that the charges were coming down the line.
And as we all try to make sense of these cases of child abuse, and we don't know as of yet what the history was of this child and the pediatric visits, what those showed, and when investigators looked at any ER visits even in the past. But typically in these cases where it ends with the death of a child, how often is there a history, other warning signs when you look back throughout a child's life, even for, in this case, the child was just 7 months old, that there were signs that abuse potentially was going on ahead of time?
Unfortunately, Chris, that is a very common occurrence. It is rare that an instance of child abuse will result in a death on a first-time occurrence. The very definition of domestic violence, the very definition of family violence is that it is a cycle of power and control. And so these abusive family situations are unfortunately not isolated incidents. They are courses of conduct typically, and there is a culminating event that will lead to something tragic like the death in this case, but it is very rare in my experience to see a one-time incident lead to a tragic result like this. In my experience, it is incredibly rare that a tragic result like this would have come about from a one-time instance, from a one-time episode. So unfortunately, I do think there is likely going to be found a history of abuse.
Marion, for you as a prosecutor, the coroner has said that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and it was an intentional act. Presuming the defense says, no, this was accidental, this was a terrible accident. As a prosecutor, how do you prove the fact that this was murder in the eyes of the authorities in a court of law?
Yeah, well, intentionality is a very, very difficult thing to prove. So it's what's known as specific intent. So murder, homicide charges are typically specific intent crimes, which means that it is the burden of the prosecutor not only to prove that a crime was committed, not only to prove that a life was taken, but also that when the actor or actors, in this case, the two parents, the two defendants that have been charged, they were acting with malice, a forethought, they were acting with premeditation, and they were acting with intentionality, meaning that whatever they did, whatever instrument was used, whatever blow was inflicted on the child was intentional, that it wasn't a mistake, that it wasn't an accident. Now, of course, the prosecution would argue things like a lack of other evidence, like calling for help or making an accidental police report, things like that they might point to. But realistically, what has to be shown through all of the circumstantial evidence is that the defendants were acting with that state of mind, with an intentionality to cause the death of this child. And that is an incredibly high standard, incredibly difficult to prove with, let's face it, no other eyewitnesses. The child certainly can't testify for herself or as to what happened to her. And so it is the job of the prosecutors to piece together with forensic evidence, with the testimony of the coroner, with crime scene photos, and depending on what the investigation reveals, with the history of this family, to prove that there was perhaps behavior that was building, that there was animus that was building, and that the steps that led to this child's death were intentional.
Man, there's still a lot of evidence that needs to be released to the public, but a very sad story being painted by authorities in South Carolina. Thank you for your perspective, as always. Marion Bracha, we appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
Both Kyla Nix and Caleb Nix are behind bars awaiting bond hearings at the time of this recording. We'll continue to follow this story on The Case for Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.